Welcome everyone to The Value of Marx's Capital Today, a roundtable discussion that will reconsider Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1 from the perspective of theory and praxis today with leading scholars of this foundational work of political economy. I'm Jonathan Catlin, and I'm a graduate student in history at Princeton University involved with a working group on Marx and his contemporaries, which organized this event. So on behalf of the group, we would like to thank Princeton's program in European Cultural Studies, the Department of Comparative Literature, and the Department of German for co-sponsoring. And to give credit where it's very much due, the title and concept for this event is inspired by an excellent series also called The Value of Marx's Capital that was organized by Paul North and I think also Paul Reitter at Yale last year, which I, for one, found extremely valuable in its own right. So we'd also highly encourage you to access that archive of discussions, which is available on YouTube. And also, if there are any Princeton students in attendance, we would invite you to join us for a workshop on the translation, sharing part of that translation with Paul Reitter and Paul North next week. So please contact me. And unfortunately, due to size constraints, that workshop is only open to Princeton students. But with that introduction said, I will turn things over to Nathan Stovall, a Princeton grad student in art history, who is going to be introducing our speakers.
Thanks to everyone who's joined us today. It's really great to see such a large turnout. It's my honor to introduce our three guests. I'll be very brief so we can go ahead and get to them as soon as possible. So first we'll hear from Paul North, who is a professor of German at Yale University, where his teaching covers a wide array of literary, philosophical, and theoretical interests across a large chronological sweep from the ancient world to the 20th century. Germane to our event today, he is the co-editor of the forthcoming translation of Capital, Volume 1, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. And he's the author of the volume's critical introduction as well. He's also the author, among many other publications, of The Problem of Distraction, published in 2011, and The Yield, Kafka's Atheological Reformation from 2015. He also helms an interdisciplinary workshop on critical theory and is researcher on the Mellon Foundation grant, Critical Theory in the Global South. And as John mentioned, in 2020, he organized the Franke Lectures series on the value of Marx's capital at Yale. Next up, we have Paul Reitter, who is a professor of German at The Ohio State University, where he's also served as director of the Humanities Institute. Professor Reiter's scholarship focuses primarily on German Jewish culture and also the history of higher education. He's co-editor with Professor North and is the sole translator of what will be the first complete annotated English critical edition of Marx's Capital, Volume 1. He is also the author of The Anti-Journalist, Karl Kraus and Jewish Self-Fashioning in Fin de Siècle Europe, released 2008, and On the Origins of Jewish Self-Hatred from 2012, as well as Bambi's Jewish Roots, Essays on German Jewish Culture, published in 2015. He's currently at work on a number of exciting projects, which include a new English translation of Max Weber's Vocation series, and with Caroline Winterer, Chad Wellman, and Princeton's own Anthony Grafton, Reitter is a co-editor of the new book series, Histories of the University. And finally, we'll hear from William Clare Roberts, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University, where his teaching focuses on the history of political thought, contemporary ethical and political thought, and social theory and philosophy of the social sciences. Professor Roberts is the author of Marx's Inferno, The Political Theory of Capital, published 2016, which kicked off the meetings for our reading group here in European Cultural Studies at Princeton. Marx's Inferno was awarded the 2017 Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize, and his work has also been published in numerous journals, including Contemporary Political Theory, 19th Century French Studies, and Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies. His writing has also appeared in Jacobin. So for the Q&A, after we hear from each of our presenters, if you have a question, either message Peter Gerardo or type it in the chat and he'll either read it or call on you. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand things over to our speakers, starting with Professor North.
Thanks very much, Nathan, and thanks to Jonathan and the group. Almost everything I say comes out of a similar group at Yale, the Critical Theory Recollective, that has been reading Marx with me and I with them, and they're the best inspiration and source of knowledge and creative ideas. As is Paul Reitter, whose translation is amazing. get ready for it and thank him for inviting me to join him in this crazy quest. And it's good to talk with him and Will today. I'm going to say a couple of things under the rubric Marx's Capital Today, although it's a little bit paradoxical, since we look to capital to tell us what today is, since if you look around, you don't see all that much. I think it goes without saying that I think capital is still the best guide to the capital system as a whole, but it needs to be reread with different emphases, as it has been over the last 150 years. Guides for looking for the new emphases are Etienne Balibar, who thinks that some of the aporias of the text still need to be worked out. Michael Heinrich, who's with the value theory group, reassessing the importance of circulation and the realization of value. And to some extent, David Harvey. Those can be guides. And all of them, I think, agree that we need to read the whole capital, what I call the capital venture, from beginning to end. Really, Marx's great sally into a world that hadn't been fully described, and that includes the discovery that either it couldn't be or he couldn't finish it in his lifetime. So there's a lot of loose threads there. You need to read from the Grundrisse all the way through the drafts. The 3 volumes, which have the hands of Engels in it, it all has the hands of Engels in it. So it needs to be read as a more of a shared project. That is, it needs to be read as a venture that doesn't arrive, but is still always arriving. And where those pushes still need to be pushed through, we can work with it. I think it also needs to be read always in that paradoxical way that's really only native to this text and maybe to the Bible and very few others, where you don't read it for the coherence of the theory or the truth of its claims, but for its historical effectiveness, the historical effectiveness of its arguments, the effectiveness of its arguments at producing the change that its very pessimistic view of the system calls for. I'm going to just mention 3 arguments, maybe 4, or categories, if you want to call them that, where we can give different emphases to the book today, where people can pick up the arguments that are somewhat telegraphic in Marx and work them out. To some extent, the measure of this book is how much work can be done with it and through it. That's clear from Marx's Capital yesterday. These are not so much explicit categories like the ones that he develops and thematizes and gives names to, like production or objectification or valorization, that are crucial for seeing the system. But they might be subcategories or sin categories, which are also, of course, processes. The first one I want to mention is pessimism, which I think is one of the most important lessons of the book, that wherever you see an opening, it's probably not. I see this as the great gift of the book, the greatness of Marx, as Deleuze called it, though he never wrote that book, I think lies in Marx's pessimism. That is a relentless call to politicize yourself and not settle with apparent solutions. There are 3 modes of this pessimism, or these are the 3 categories or emphases that I would like to see developed. The first one is mystification. And we know this a little bit from the emphasis on the commodity fetish over the past 75 years or so, or even more. And that's an important one. But there are 2 other modes of mystification. One is the wage form, which mystifies not only laborers by convincing them that they get what they pay for, so to speak, that they're getting a wage that's equivalent to the amount of time they work, but also the owners, who also believe that. The mystifications branch out, and none of them in the Capital Project is equivalent to ideology, at least the ideology as it was articulated much earlier. And the third form of mystification, which really hasn't been dealt with, is the revenue form. That is what Marx calls the economic trinity in the 3rd volume, where land, labor, and capital seem to be equal sources for profit or value. And that is a mystification that lays over the whole system that's very hard to get out of. So that's a place where I think more work could be done, an emphasis we could bring out. The next one I want to call extortion. It's not something that he thematizes so much. Marx focuses more on the two other X words in the book, extraction, which we associate with primitive accumulation or so-called primitive accumulation, and exploitation. There's been a lot of work done on exploitation, and it's a linchpin of the class struggle view of the book. But extortion comes between extraction, a kind of first taking, and exploitation, an ongoing taking of more, and is the functional meaning of private property. What is extortion? The fact that the owners of the means of production hold it, and in order to get any work done out of it, the workers have to go to the owners. They extort the labor out of the owners by holding on to the means of production. And I think extortion is moving around a lot today and needs to be understood. If you focus on extortion, the main political expression of the capital social system doesn't seem to be class struggle necessarily. And then the last one I will just mention quickly, and that's subsumption, which is dealt with again in rudimentary or telegraphic form in the so-called unpublished chapter 6, particularly real subsumption. That's something that's taken on a new force these days, where the involvement in the capital system has moved from necessity and discipline or authority, the authority of a manager or an owner, to the new autonomy, where people consider it their own self-obligation to do everything that capital tells them to do. That is maybe equivalent to the liberal idea of freedom, Marx's real subsumption. So those are the three main, very pessimistic categories: extortion, subsumption, and mystification. I think they're still really live, and they need research groups and they need spokespeople. I think I'll stop there and pass on to Paul Reitter.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for working with me on this project. I know I'm always happy to have the opportunity to thank you publicly. It's really been such a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the continued collaboration. To the group, thank you so much for inviting us. This is a great forum, and we're really happy to be here doing this. I have taken the liberty of tweaking my charge a little bit, and I'm going to talk about translating capital in the 21st century rather than the general relevance of capital in the 21st century, although these things intersect, and I think that there are some ideas about reading capital in this little presentation, reading capital now, points of emphasis that are right now especially relevant. So, and it does seem to be the case that people are interested in the process of translation or the process of translating this book in particular, and this is really what I'm best qualified to talk about. So that's the logic of organizing the presentation as I have. All translators deal with pressures, starting with the pressures generated by the sense of responsibility to the source text. There are also pressures that arise from the particular translation tastes of the moment you're operating in, but retranslators have added pressures, special pressures, because one of the ways you justify the existence of a retranslation is by saying how the retranslation is different from the existing translations. And of course, this pressure then varies with the situation, with the existing translations, how many there are, what their standing is, what they've done, what they've emphasized. Freud is a well-known example for this. The copyright on his text expired. or the translation rights became public domain basically around 2000, and there was this standard edition that literally talked about itself as the standard edition to deviate from, and the standard edition had a very clear direction and objective, which was to make Freud sound like a 19th century man of science, which it did. And the retranslations took that as their starting point and deviated in different ways from that with varying levels of success. With Marx, with Capital, that's not really the case. There are 3 translations, English translations. I should say, I'm just talking about the English translation situation here. And of the 3, 2 are fairly well known. The original Moore Aveling translation from 1886, and then the Fowkes translation from 1976. There was a translation from 1929 by a couple, Eden and Cedar Paul, that was panned by the leading Marx scholar of the day. This was 1929, David Ryazanov, and it seemed never really to recover from that. The first translation had the obvious pressure of wanting to get the word out on a wanting to, or rather make a text accessible that had obvious political potential. And very often in this situation, there's a tendency to translate into a natural prose. And while Engels, who oversaw the project, had a lot of very interesting reflections on translation, and in a somewhat biting essay from 1883, where he's talking about an early translation of English translation of Capital, though it was just a very partial translation, snarkily entitled "How Not to Translate Marx." Engels says he has a lot of astute points to make about the challenges of translating Marx and the importance of trying to preserve the force of utterance here, the concision and vigor, as he puts it, while also maintaining rigor with regard to the key concepts. But the Moore Aveling translation that he oversaw doesn't necessarily do all that. I mean, it's a lot to do. It's obviously very hard. And it seems to kind of go in the direction ultimately of trying to present the text in a fairly natural English prose. Some people have claimed that it's not entirely successful in this. In fact, the justification for this 1929 translation was that we need a more readable translation of Capital. But you can see this in the very first sentence of the book, where the German term that's used to talk about how the wealth of societies appears as, or sorry, the German term is erscheint als, and the Moore Aveling translation, there are two instances of it in the first sentence. It's not an easy term to translate into English. There isn't a natural fit for it, and the Moore Aveling translation translates it in one case as presents itself as, and then in the other case it basically just gets rid of it and uses is, essentially. And another example of this naturalizing tendency would be the formulation where Marx introduces the notion of value, where the German is this poetic, oxymoronic, difficult, unusual term or phrase, gespenstige Gegenständlichkeit, and this is translated as unsubstantial reality. So the Fowkes translation from 1976, and there's something perhaps of a tradition of not doing quite what you say you're going to do in translating Capital into English. I hope that I may be able to break out of that translation, but Fowkes justifies this translation in his preface by saying that the literary qualities of the text weren't conveyed so well by the Moore Aveling translation, and also that the language is a little dated, and so a new translation is in order. And of course, the longer the time between translations, the easier it is to justify a new translation, because the language does change over time, and Fowkes relies on that. That part of the justification seems fine. The literary qualities part seems perhaps to be a little bit off in retrospect, because his translation is one that goes for formal equivalence, that doesn't seem to be that worried about conforming to the norms of the target language, which here is English. And if you're looking for contextual reasons for that, you could say that, well, obviously there existed this translation, that previous translation, that had a somewhat natural sound, but with certain concepts seemed not to preserve Marx's intended meaning so well. Witness the Geschwätzige Gegenständlichkeit translation in the more Aveling edition. But also, this is a text that by that time was, of course, 1976, extremely well known, and there wasn't the need to get the word out about the text to hope that people would be interested in the text. And at the same time, there wasn't exactly at this moment necessarily a great new audience for the text, because there didn't seem, this wasn't a moment where there was in the English-speaking world at least, a great wellspring of interest in Marx. And it's interesting to note that there was very little discussion of Fowkes's translation when it came out in 1976. It's very hard to find reviews of this translation. And so he was operating to an extent without the pressure of producing an edition for a new audience of people freshly interested in Marx. Today, of course, that's quite it's quite different. And one of the things that's exciting about doing this today is that there is a new interest in Marx, and there are young readers of Marx. Millennial Marxists is a term that has been thrown around a bit since the Great Recession, and the prospect of producing an edition that will be useful for such readers is really exciting for both me and Paul. But it does create a certain kind of pressure. These are readers who are perhaps not used to reading English translations of German philosophical material, and the convention these days in translating German philosophical material into English is to translate, as is sometimes to translate down. This is a term that's sometimes used in translation theory, which is to proceed as Fowkes proceeded, not paying a great deal of attention to naturalizing, to conforming to the norms of contemporary English, and to meet the needs of this new audience that's not necessarily so well versed in English translations of German philosophical material. That might get in the way of doing that, of providing an edition that is engaging for that audience. And I should say that in the original, the book is extremely hard, but at times very vibrant. I think that Engel's description is quite apt, concise and vigorous. The prose is concise and vigorous a great deal of the time, and so that is one challenge. A competing challenge, in a way, is that Fowkes, too, to an extent, didn't render some of the concepts in a satisfying way. Fowkes produced his edition before the new reading of Marx developed, and there was a new emphasis on the representation of value, what value actually is. And I don't have the sense that Fowkes was super interested in following Marx's shifts of terminology as he tries to evoke what value is. And there have been calls for a new English translation that has a higher degree of conceptual rigor And one of these calls, a recent call, has in areas like this, and one of these recent calls has pointed out that that English has become the international language of Marx study, which creates an added level of responsibility and pressure. And so these are some of the things that one contends with in translating Capital today. I hope that I didn't make it sound like an oppressive situation. It's not. It's, I think, quite interesting if you're interested in the theory of translation in addition to the practice of translation. And I came to translation having first written about translation in a theoretical way. And so I am very interested in the predicament in which I find myself, and or the situation, I should say, in which I find myself. And I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on it.
So the question is, when it's time, are there any insights you're able to share based on your translation work so far about the account given of value and value form in volume 1?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Translation, this is, I think, fairly obvious, is, among other things, a very intense form of reading. And I think that you could get to many of the insights that you arrive at translating by reading very intensely, but perhaps in translation you're going beyond even fairly extreme close reading in tracking the different terms that Marx uses for naming things. And in any case, what I'm trying to suggest here is that I'm not sure that I have come up with singular insights into some of these things in the process of translating, but I have noticed some things and gained clarity on some things, and certainly around value. I have noticed that Marx's language, Marx seems initially to be a little inconsistent in some of his terms, in particular with the term value thing, which is perhaps one of the reasons why there's some conceptual confusion around value and what value is and the materiality of value. Marx introduces the term value thing, Wert Ding, in German, to talk about what commodities are without their physical side, when they're just value. And as just value, they have an objecthood. They are like objects in some ways and behave like objects in some ways, and as real as objects, but without having the physical side of the physical dimension of objects, that is, without being physical objects. And Marx then uses this same term to talk about Wert Ding in one instance, to talk about this term as in the context of, so he uses this term also in the context of the value relation, where the equivalent, the commodity in equivalent form expresses the value of the commodity in the relative value form. And he moves after this one use of Wert Ding to talk about now not commodities as just value objects, but the specific function of a commodity whose body serves as the mode of expression for another commodity. He moves after this one instance to using the term value body, Wertkörper. Is this is this the key to understanding value? Clearly not, but I do think that it says something about the in-process character of Marx's work on value in this text. This is something that comes out in other ways. Marx did a lot of revising in the area of the language around value between the first edition and the second edition. But there are subtle further markers of this that you would pick up on by reading very closely, but perhaps more readily by translating.
Yeah.
Okay, this question's from Ari Linden. She says, I have a very specific translation question. I'm working on an essay on Marx in which the term vogelfrei in volume 1 plays a significant role. Folks translate it as free and rightless to describe the emergent proletariat in the section on the so-called primitive accumulation. What have you gone with, and can you give an account of your translation choice?
This is taking on the character of a tribunal slowly, but that's okay. That's good. Ari, hello. If this is the Ari Linden I know, vogelfrei is one of many colloquial terms that Marx uses that doesn't have a particularly good match in English. And Marx is, I think that Faust's translation is generally good. I tried to find a colloquial expression in English that would convey the sort of language that Marx is using here, and didn't really come up with anything. So I have gone with, I also not going to be able to recall precisely every every translation in the text. I mean, this is one that's fairly prominent just off the top of my head, but this is a fairly prominent one. It occurs quite a few times in the primitive accumulation section, and I use vogelfrei, free and defenseless, I think, and it has the meaning of someone who is on the outside of the law, in the sense of not being protected by the law.
Great. Another question, I suppose, to all panelists from Terence Renaud. He says, lately I've been paying closer attention to Marx's ideas of personification, dramatis personae, and character roles in his account of class and how the categories of capitalist society appear to us. Has the new translation effort enabled any fresh insights into these ideas?
Well, Paul Reitter is probably best one to answer that, but I'll just give a shout out to Terry. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it is one of the most important focuses of the new translation to make sure that the rhetorical strategies are not covered over. It seems to us as important as the dialectic that there are personifications in the sense of an anthropomorphism of a non-human thing, but also that it turns into a script at times where the capitalist speaks and the worker speaks, although the worker speaks after the capitalist. So there is a kind of argument to the action as well. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. That has been one of the biggest translation challenges here, and biggest in the sense of it's something that you deal with throughout the text if it's something that you're interested in, and this is because personification is such an important part of the argument, the idea that capital has agency, that capital is dead labor that comes back to life by sucking the life out of living labor. But at the same time, German is a language that is, you could say in comparison to English, more personifying. There are a lot of reflexive verbs used in German with inanimate objects, things generally, so that questions raise themselves. And if you translate in a kind of formal equivalence style, your English winds up sounding like conspicuously personifying English. And commodities do a lot of stepping forth toward each other in this text, where Marx uses a reflexive formulation, and you have to decide whether or not this is German being German, or is Marx being programmatically personified. And if you just follow the German, and the English then has this generally personifying feel, you run the risk of dulling the reader's sensitivity to personification. And those moments of programmatic personification that really matter might get a bit lost amid all of this personification. So I've been trying to make thoughtful choices here, and to make sure that the weirdness of some of Marx's translation, excuse me, of some of the source text, the original capital, comes out. And so in a way, my translation goes in a couple of directions at once. I try to make the prose sound natural in places, or push the prose in a slightly natural direction in places, in the service of allowing this strangeness to really be conveyed. And it's interesting that Fowkes, I think it's interesting that Fowkes, who has something of a formal equivalence or orientation, does in fact pull back a bit on Marx's personification at times. And it's not totally clear to me why he does that. He translates a lot of reflexive verbs as reflexive verbs, and the result is a kind of unusual personifying feel in English. But at the same time, he shies away from translating passages or lines where Marx has things doing people that, where Marx has things doing things that people usually do. He shies away from translating them in that way, and often translates capital as the capitalist. So instead of capital doing something, the capitalist does something. So I thought
maybe I could add something here too. It's a really interesting discussion. I think Paul and I are trying to be aware where the intention of the book, which is to show the distorted, inverted, and really strange modes of agency, where the source of agency shifts and might be said to come from capital itself, where Marx's really innovative interpretation of a social system is making use of German structures to express itself. So the political aim is to show, to put it really coarsely, that individual liberal styled agency is a kind of a phantom. That's one element, but there are many different varieties of shifts in the locus of agency. So there's the early shifts between people and things, where they reverse their roles and the things take the people to market, for example. But even when the capitalist speaks, there's a sense in which the capitalist is not a person so much as already a personification of capital or an instrument of capital. So you can't do all of this interpretive work with the translation, but we're really trying to stay close to one of the fundamental insights of the book, which is that agency, if there even is such a thing, is in conflict with the needs of the system and is really more expressing systematic functions than it is like cause and effect, as agency is usually thought of, or like action. So this is what I think of as part of the pessimism, the structural pessimism of the book, is that really you can't think of resistance, because resistance is a form of action, and action doesn't seem possible. I think that's where he gets to when he decides to write a system like this. But maybe Terry, I don't know if we can open Terry's mic if he's still there. He wants to say what's interesting to him about personification. Yeah. It's one of the most important modes or metaphors or operations in the book.
Okay. Sorry, I have a baby napping on my chest, so I'll try to be brief and only say that I agree with you that the issues of personification and agency seem crucial to determining whether capitalism is a system of impersonal domination, which may contain many petty personal tyrannies, but essentially, as you were saying, Paul North, one that makes us think seriously about whether and to what degree resistance should be conceptualized as a form of agency. I've been reading Postone lately too, rereading Postone, and I'm grappling with his wonderful image or metaphor of capitalism as a infernal Rube Goldberg machine that's constantly breaking down, but also repairing itself through expansion. And this is just a wonderful image of impersonal domination. So anyways, that's the line of thought that I've been pursuing. And I look forward to reading this new translation of Capital, just to pay specific attention to those moments where we encounter Mr. Moneybags and the variety of personalized metaphors in the text. So thank you.
Thanks.
Just to add one thing to this is also, of course, a point of really interesting tension, since Marx was a person who harbored personal enmities, and he is in Capital unable perhaps to refrain from going after certain individuals whose behavior he finds particularly appalling, and how he frames those criticisms is worth reading carefully. There's some qualifying language suggesting that, but of course, it's not really the case that it's the individual will of capitalists that creates that we should be focusing on here, and yet he deals at some length with these individual cases, and so there is that side of the text too. And some of the funniest moments in the text are where he's going after these people and underlining their excesses, and the way he sets up these some of this this behavior that he catalogs is pretty memorable.
I was trying to say that I think that that I approach Capital. I think Capital is valuable as a piece of social theory, and so I want to try to explain what that means. And I was starting to say this, that I think Capital is kind of a weird text, and I'm going to have some qualified disagreements with Paul North here, but we'll get to that. Where I think of it as being both a very composed text, something that Marx spent a lot of time on and thought very hard about, and as being very incomplete in all sorts of ways in its analyses. I think of it as being very tightly argued, but also very open textured. There's a lot of openings in the text, places to go into it, and places for analyses that he's started to be developed in all sorts of different ways. And this was the last thing I was mentioning, was that I think it's more connected to its context and to Marx's other works than sometimes it seems. But it's also much more idiosyncratic and discontinuous than is often appreciated. So, and I want to spend a little time on that in just a second. I want to give an example of each of those three sort of paradoxes that hopefully will give some more concreteness to my thoughts here. The first, an example of the first thing, an example of the way in which it is very composed, but also quite incomplete. I guess I would say that one thing that I've stressed in my own work on Capital and in some of my comments, for example, at the Franke Lectures that Paul and Paul hosted at Yale, was the way in which I think Capital is composed as a book and has to be approached as a book. but I would differentiate between approaching it as a book and approaching it as a system. I think it's quite complete as a book, but very open as a system. It's not a system in the sense that you might think of a closed system. And the example that comes to mind is the sort of strategic advice that I think is buried by Marx in part 4, which is that he thinks that the workers' movement should focus on the fight for a shorter work day and shorter work week, right? To decrease the hours of work. He thinks that this is the way forward for the workers' movement. And I think this is the closest thing to something like an accelerationist strand in Marx, right? Not in the sense of, the worse the better, but in the sense of pushing on one dynamic in capitalist production in order to elicit the sort of response from the system that will strengthen your position. I think this is never really developed by Marx anywhere, right? If you read through the meeting notes from the International Working Men's Association from the late 60s and early 70s, you see this as something that Marx is trying to do. But after the Paris Commune, it just gets dropped, right? So in other words, there's a sort of politico-strategic hypothesis that's embedded in the text of Capital that doesn't ever really get examined or really expounded as such by Marx, and that I think is worth examining and paying attention to on its own terms. So that's one example. A second example of the sort of second paradox, right, of the way in which it's both tightly argued and very open textured, is that I think that I would say that the entire argument of Capital is like, it emerges basically from 3 distinctions that Marx makes. 2 of them he's quite explicit about and quite proud of. And the last one is a bit more implicit, and I think because it became more important later on. I think it's a distinction that matters more now than Marx could have realized at the time. But the first distinction is the distinction between concrete labor and abstract labor, right? And the second distinction is the distinction between labor and labor power. Those 2 distinctions are like that's the motor of all of the dynamics of value production. Value production, the dynamics of the capitalist system emerge from the tension between those distinguished terms, right? Between the concrete labor that is carried out by a body in a particular labor process, and the abstract labor, the abstract socially necessary labor that goes into the formation of value. And similarly, between the labor that the worker does and the labor power that they sell. These are the space between those terms is the space that gives dynamism to Marx's model. And the third distinction, the one that is less explicitly developed by Marx, but that I think is crucial for understanding Capital as a book, is a distinction, a tripartite distinction between capital, the capitalist mode of production, and society in which the capitalist mode of production reigns, or what we have come to call capitalism, right? And that distinction between capital, the capitalist mode of production, and capitalism is absolutely central, I think, to understanding Marx's argument about primitive accumulation, and for a number of other aspects of the book. And I think, though, so I think in that sense, Marx's argument is very tight. Like it comes from a few logical distinctions that he makes, and playing out the consequences of those distinctions. But like all of the ramifications of those distinctions, Marx doesn't play those out completely, I think. I think he partly fleshes those out in the book. I think there are many partial analyses and hinted at arguments in Capital 1, which could be followed up on the basis of those distinctions. And I think in that sense, Capital could very well be, could be something that it hasn't always been, is a sort of founding text of a sort of normal science, right? A normal science of society in which the capitalist mode of production reigns. The third example that I want to point to very quickly is, and this is the one where I'm going to, I think, come into some tension with Paul North in his comments. So this is about the way in which I think Marx, the capital is very connected to its context, including Marx's corpus as a whole, and is at the same time quite idiosyncratic and discontinuous, and more discontinuous than is often appreciated. Because, so in my book, I focus a lot on the way in which Marx appropriates and redeploys tropes and phrases and images from existing socialist discourse, right? That these tropes and images, they change their meaning and their function when Marx puts them to work in a different context of analysis, in a different argument. So some of the examples from my book that I work with, social hell, like the money mystery, fetishism, the notion of vampirism, right? Exploitation itself as a term. You could multiply these examples. But Marx does the same sort of thing with tropes and images and little verbal phrases from his own work, right? So, for example, Marx loves metaphors of inversion, right? He loves this image of being dominated by one's own product. Right? He loves the trope of relations between people being mediated by things, right? Or appearing as a relationship between things. These tropes and metaphors drawn from Marx's own work, I think, are often treated as self-evident indices of continuity between Capital and earlier works by Marx, and later works by Marx. But I think they don't always function the same way in Capital that they function in other works. In fact, I don't think they even function the same way in one part of Capital as they do in other parts of Capital. So in other words, I think there is not in Marx, for example, a concept of alienation or of objectification or of inversion, which is unified across all of its different moments of expression, or simply applied to different instances. Rather, I would say there are phrases, there are associations, verbal formulae, images, which seem to connect diverse analyses, but actually get taken up and deployed to diverse effects in different argumentative contexts. And I think that this is one thing that I really appreciated working through the new translation, is that I think there's a way in which Marx's verbal tics give a patina of continuity to discontinuous analyses. And I think Paul Reitter was gesturing at this with like the way in which, this phrase of, Verting, it doesn't work in exactly the same way in different contexts, right? And I think you can multiply that by other instances as well. So those would be the sorts of things that I would say. I really wanted to just emphasize that I think work on Capital as a text of social theory, I think there's almost endless opportunity for elaboration and continuous work. So I think there's just a ton to do, and I'm really excited for this new translation to come out, because I hope it'll be a spur to getting on with some of that work that needs to get done. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're gonna now turn to some questions. So I think this is directed towards all panelists. This is from Nicole Ann Lobo. I have a question about the framing of pessimism over an imperative to act. How do we square this with the way Marx, expanded upon by David Harvey, explored, for instance, the 7 components of a revolutionary moment? and the types of social consciousnesses needed for material change to be enacted? Does pessimism not imply instead a state of stagnation that might be antithetical to Marx's aims? I guess more specifically, why choose pessimism in an age where potentials for revolutionary change of the variety Marx attempted to engender through class consciousness already seems harder to imagine than the end of the world?
Paul, we can't hear you. Maybe you're
Here I
there.
am,
Yeah,
caught between various muting functions.
right.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, pessimism is certainly going to be controversial. Well, taking Marx's, what I see as extreme pessimism about the effectiveness of any kind of action under this regime that he describes in excruciating detail, and often to the point of pointing towards exactly the reasons why there's no quick way out, especially in the if you take the whole Capital compilation from beginning to end. He just piles on reasons why no one's going to see it, no one's going to act on it. The individuals who act on it can move some things, and often for the good. But to produce the kind of social change he earlier thought was necessary in the revolutionary phase, there doesn't seem to be any real movement. I think that's good, at least as a propedeutic to thinking bigger. That's what I think. In a sense, the end of the world is the ultimate pessimism that we've all come to, right? And we had to wait to come to it, at least in environmental terms. So had everyone realized that the end of the world was the consequence of these little actions earlier, that ultimate pessimism might have brought bigger action or more decisive action to stop what has now become apparently inevitable. So do I think of it as a kind of no to all action? No, I think of it as a challenge to act bigger and think bigger, which I definitely think was on Marx's mind. Just to take the opportunity to respond to Will, I totally agree with you, Will, and I think in my, at least about the way the text has to be reconstructed and the concepts can't be just simply lifted out, as some people have done over history of reading it, to use as tools or easy representations of parts of the system. I agree. Marx is writing a text, and he's particularly alive to the way these processes reconfigure themselves under different parts of the system. So I don't mean to argue that the text doesn't need to be read, but the question would be, for me, how does that reading of the text, a real reading of the text, which I advocate too, join up with the people who want to think that bigger question? Where is the end of capital?
Could I hop in at this point? I guess I would say, I wanted to say two things. First of all, I completely agree with your response here to this question. And my thought would be something like, I guess I was reacting to something about the interaction between you and Terry Renaud earlier too, about the disappearance of agency in capital behind sort of the impersonal and the systematic aspect. And I guess I just want to challenge everyone to think those two things together, that in fact, I think agency is all through capital. There's agency everywhere. And yet there is not the sort of effectiveness at changing the overall social form. So it's about the disconnect between the fact that people are active all over the place, and the fact that that activity nonetheless does not push on the dynamics of capital in such a way as to break free into something else, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'm very attracted to this, you know, very partial, only barely hinted at political strategy that Marx has operative in part 4 of the book. And so that's the sort of thing that I'm thinking about.
Just a quick, very quick response. I don't want to dominate this just between us, but well, I love you. I love your reading. So I'll just put that out there. And I'm all for looking for other ghosts of political forms throughout the dossier. But I do think also that we need to rethink the form of agency and even that concept. I'm not sure that it goes anymore with this book, particularly if you think of subsumption. Agency already thinks it's agentive. And I don't think simply removing the veil of agency from the false agents, the agents that are doing capital's bidding, really, let's say, to use Marx's zombie metaphors. I think agency might be the problem. So what is another mode of action, if you want to put it that way, or resistance? You know, a strike is already a kind of non-agentive action that has a bigger consequence. So already there are modes of non-agentive action. Also working on the law. I hate to be banal, but working on the law is not agentive. It's interpretive. So I would push for people looking for something other than agency, but I know I'm going up against a crowd with that assertion.
I'm totally on your side on that
We might be on the same side, Will.
one.
Okay, so this is another question for all panelists. What, if anything, has been learned about Marx's literary influences from doing this new translation?
That seems like something Paul Reitter should tackle first.
Yeah, well, learned, that is, that's not so easy to say. This is a topic that's been treated in detail by a great Germanist of the post-war era, German Jewish emigre in Marx and world literature. SS Prahr catalogues pretty exhaustively the Marx's literary influences and talked about the stylistic impact that various figures had on him, and of course the quotations, direct and indirect, and Capital have been also tracked by the German, most recent German critical edition, the Mega edition. So if the question is, have you noticed that Marx has a connection to an author that he hasn't previously been associated with in working on Capital, then I would say no. If the question is more, have you noticed affinities with or have you noticed something that hasn't been appreciated about perhaps the extent of those affinities? I guess I don't really have a great answer for that, or even anything coming close to that, really. I think that here, for me, the standard the standard impressions hold up fairly well, but Will, who's looked at the the relation of Marx's political language to political language that he hadn't been associated with so much, is probably in a better position to talk about this question in a meaningful way. So I'm going to hand it back to Will with an apology for the general vacuousness of this answer.
I mean, I think Paul is, I think Paul's right that, like, in some sense, the literary references of capital have been pretty exhaustively cataloged, at least. But I will say one thing that I appreciated anew working through the new translation is the way in which Marx's citation, I'm thinking especially like his biblical citations, right? His biblical citations, they're not just disembodied phrases. Like, if you follow those biblical citations and look at the context that those biblical citations are coming from, they make more sense of the context in Capital in which they are cited, right? So when he talks, for example, about well, and some of these citations aren't always noted in previous translations, but like when he talks about every commodity being like when the commodity looks at every other commodity and sees in every one a circumcised Jew, right? So this is a citation of Paul, and there's a, like, it makes, like, the reference to Paul's letter, when you read Paul's letter, that reaffirms what Marx is trying to say with that reference in chapter 1 of Capital. So I think that sort of intertextuality is more apparent to me all the time.
I wonder if you would agree, Will, with this assertion that Paul and I are trying to maintain some more extended dramas that go through, especially the first few chapters, where there's, for example, a Bible salesman who comes to the door and ministers who are treated to the great idea that they might be selling their Bibles for money and getting not quite the full value of it. There's a kind of satire of religion that goes on, but also, I think throughout the whole book, religious words are used to indicate that capitalism is a religion. Is that something you have noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interplay between the sort of strictly theoretical or strictly economic account of capital and the account of capital as a religion of everyday life, as a sort of cultic practice of social life, is I think that's a rich and robust thread throughout Capital, for sure.
Yeah, so we're trying to keep that together. Sorry, Paul. We're just trying to keep that together so it's as palpable to English readers as it would be to German readers.
Yeah, these moments where there's simultaneously satire and a real attempt at illumination by using an analogy from religion. I just want to add one thing to my response to the question, and that is that if you're talking about the literariness of the text, and have I noticed things about that, or have we noticed things about that we haven't seen discussed elsewhere, then definitely that's the case. That's an answer to a slightly different question. So if you're interested in that answer, then I encourage you to, to write into the chat, and hopefully we'll connect with it.
So there's one question that I think picks up on these questions of religion, and it is to all panelists. What are we to make of the various references in Capital Volume 1 to Catholicism and various increasingly deistic Protestant religious conceptions?
I'm not sure what to say. I wonder if the asker has a specific spot in mind or figure.
Maybe that person can message me. Just move on to another. So this is a potentially nitpicky question, translation question. He asks, he says, so Marx quotes a lot from English sources, Smith, Nassau Senior, the Parliamentary Blue Book reports, etc. In the original German, does he quote these in English? If not, is the project of translation in this project of translation, did you have recourse to the original English sources, or did you retranslate out of Marx's German translation? Aside from archival pedantry, does this have any impact on thinking about Marx's contextual engagements?
Sure. I want to come back to the religion question for a moment, but first I'll answer this question and let my fellow panelists, of course, weigh in as well. Marx translates most of the English material that he cites. The bulk of the English material he cites is English factory inspectors' reports. And if there are heroes in capital, it's English factory inspectors whom Marx lionizes in the preface. And sorry, I think I cut out there for just a second. And these reports are available, and so we cite from the original reports. There is a loss there because Marx's translation operations are interesting. He was a pretty aggressive translator, meaning that he tends to make people sound like he does. English factory inspectors and also some of the political economists he is interested in distinguishing himself from. So that's kind of an interesting, and you could say to some extent, self-subverting move, although Paul and I have talked about this. It also allows for kind of satire in a way. Or it's part of a satirical operation of taking in and almost kind of cannibalizing. It's also, I think, worth noting that a lot of the terms Marx uses are near translations. They are based on an English term, but Marx is using it in a new way, so that you can't simply just find the English original and go with that term. The most prominent example, of course, is primitive accumulation, which in English is previous accumulation, and Marx notes that he's also doing something a little different. And so one of the challenges in translating the text is to allow those moments that have a translation-y feel in the original to have a translation-y feel in the translation, without just feeling like, oh, this is a translation-y moment in a translation. In other words, a moment where the translator just, didn't do a particularly proficient job at translating, and it sounds like a translation, which is, generally considered to be not such a great thing in a translation. That's, that's hard, and I don't know how well I've done, but I can say that I've tried my best.
Did you want to elaborate on the religious question, or?
Just that I was going to let Paul and Will jump in here, but since you asked, there is something of a movement in the discussions of religion where Marx has some jokes about the Bible seller early on in the text, and then Trinitarian thinking does play an important role in his illustration of capital and what capital is. And in the fetish section, religion shows up there in an important way. Obviously, the concept of the fetish comes from discussions of religion. And then it seems to me that later in the text, Marx focuses a little more on religious hypocrisy. And so he's not using theology to illustrate things so much as pointing out the hypocrisy of putatively pious people who use religion to justify their exploitation, their ruthless exploitation. One of the examples that he cites repeatedly is that of Quakers who push against laws regulating child labor by suggesting that, or claiming that, it would be bad for the children's souls if they weren't working so much because idleness is dangerous for young people.
Yeah, I don't think I have a ton to add to what Paul said there, but I would just second, I would second both of those things. I mean, and I think I would just add to the question of Marx as translator that, I mean, you could say that Marx is a very loose translator, or he's robust in his translations, right? He does a lot. He doesn't hide his hand in his translations, and I think that's also true in his. I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in is the translation of the second German edition into French edition, and that Marx as a, I mean, he didn't translate it himself, but he heavily revised the translation. And I think that you can see Marx's sort of constantly revising and never overly, like, he's not overly fussy about like he's not a super neat and tidy translator. He is someone who makes sort of strong translation choices, and they're not always 100% consistent. There's quite a bit of variety in the sort of things that he does with his own verbal phrases.
Great. Okay. Well, then quickly, just a final question, because we do have to close up in about two to 3 minutes. Are there any linguistic differences between Marx's earlier attempts of writing Volume 1? So, for example, the contribution in 1859 and Capital itself.
Will, you're really the expert on Marx's rhetoric, so I'm going to give you the floor here.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think this is a good question, and one that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. So I think it's a great question, and something to look into. But it's not a particular thing that I have tried to do in any sort of, certainly in any sort of systematic way. Like, there are lots of people who spend a lot of time thinking about how his value theory changes from 1857 to 1859 to 1867 to 1872, or how his presentation of his value theory changes. And there are certainly some important questions of how he puts things, his phrasing, his how he does changes, how he talks about particular things over that period of time. But in a broader way than that, I'm not sure the answer of this question.
I think there are.
I'll just add that we have been working with a digital humanist, or we're connected with a very energetic and gifted digital humanist who has been developing some tools for analyzing Capital, the structure, the syntax, the vocabulary. And so we may have more to say about this beyond that. Yeah, there are some interesting changes in the terms Marx uses for important individual concepts. Maybe I kind of have the sense that there are some syntactical patterns that are unique to Capital, and that Marx may have written the text with the idea in mind that it would be translated into English, and he did some things perhaps to facilitate that. But I don't really have significant evidence to back that up. But maybe through this collaboration with the digital humanist Jeff Jacobs, there's no reason not to name him by name, we'll be able to document some of these impressions.
I thought we could just say before we close that this translation, if we didn't say this before, is the only one from the second German edition that Marx saw through the publication phase. So the other translations are all from, I believe, the fourth edition, which was tinkered with in interesting ways by Engels. We've gone back to the second edition, and we will be supplementing it with important moments from the French edition where there's really something at stake. We'll be footnoting all of those and including some in the text. So this is going to be, we think, a more reliable text, at least to carry forth his intentions.
Great. Before I hand it over to Jonathan, just want to thank all the speakers. It was an excellent discussion, and there's obviously more to come with the translation itself. And Paul North and Paul Reitter will be actually hosting a podcast in the coming year on many of these themes. So thanks again.